Hello and welcome to another episode of Nationalist Radio America, 2 in 1 day for my birthday. I am joined yet again by the Western One, who is more than ready to spend some time discussing, I think, we'll probably go about three big topics today. And Western One, thanks again for joining me. So the first topic we'll talk about is one that I've kind of been ruminating on this week, and that is the new right. Have you heard of Red Pill Black?
I have heard of her, yes.
Okay, so, her real name is Candace Owens, and she's kind of a new sort of up-and-coming YouTuber talking about sort of conservative issues. And she was there was I suppose one could call it a controversy with Paul Joseph Watson, who sort of rushed to her defense as, sort of cucky white knight. And her case is so very interesting to me because what ended up happening, the whole reason there's a controversy in the first place, is because it was found out that Candace Owens, Red Pill Black, less than a year ago, was by her own admission, a sort of devout liberal, and created this thing. It was called social autopsy, and the idea behind it was like a doxing site for cyberbullying, right? Anything that was considered hate speech. What would happen is people would screenshot whatever you said, upload it to the site, and then literally dox you. Your place of employment, your age, your date of birth, your name, everything about you was right there. So, there was some sort of internet accountability for what you said. Aside from that being a totally despicable thing to even think of, now she says, well, I've had my red pill moment, as Paul Joseph Watson says, she had a red pill moment and now she's different. So there's a whole lot to talk about here, Western One, and I kind of just want to, I guess, start on the small issue. It's not a small issue. Can people's political opinions change?
I do think that on small issues, people's political opinions can change, but I think it's very specific to certain things, right? So, can a person who considers himself or herself, right, conservative, think that socialized medicine is a net benefit for the people, right? And I think the answer there can be yes or no. And I think you can change your idea based on what your perception is of, well, is it good for conserving the nation, or is it bad because it is not economically conservative in the sense that it's not completely laissez-faire? And I think that the problem that we often have is that we use certain issues to define us overall, right? And so I think that what we have to really do is just determine, well, am I overall a traditional conservative, or am I a person who is a liberal that believes that nothing really has value inherently? And I think that's really where we have to get into, well, can you change your opinion, and do you really believe it? Are you changing your idea based on the current year, or are you basing it off of a fundamental personal understanding of an issue?
That's a fantastic point. And I'm going to harp on a number of issues there because, wow, that's a whole can of worms that you just opened up. So, for one, the way people like to look at politics is sort of a line, right? You're left or you're right, and somewhere in between there's a little centrist little bubble, and they exist somewhere in the middle, right? In fact, I think that politics can be most accurately described kind of as two 2 lines, 2 lines. 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 2 lines where you have sort of like economic, well, maybe even three. You have sort of economic, governmental policies, and social policies, right? So these three big points. Boom, boom, boom. And I think you can be a left-leaning conservative, for example. That is to say, socially, you believe in traditionalism, you believe in strong moral values, you believe in A, B, C, and D. But you also believe in social programs and sort of social justice type things. I totally think that's possible. I don't think those are two incompatible beliefs. And you said something really interesting about sort of your fundamental understanding of the world. I think this is, to me, the biggest issue with Red Pill Black. And I might even argue Paul Joseph Watson. I have been blessed with living a very sort of secluded, reclusive, isolative life. And as such, I've been able to really, really examine my own personal beliefs and convictions. And I don't think a lot of people are afforded that luxury. And I wouldn't say it has necessarily been a net positive for me. There are certainly a lot of things that have negatively affected me about that type of lifestyle. But overall, the convictions that I do hold are deeply held and well reasoned and typically pretty well thought out. And what I've found more recently is that we see a bunch of people coming out, Red Pill Black being one of them, who seek to sort of change the opinion of like the mainstream. How do I put this? So like, I think that it's fair to say that on YouTube, the so-called conservative is actually like farther right politically and certainly socially than the mainstream idea of conservative. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely.
So yeah, it's definitely further right. And what happens is these people come in and they say, hey, I'm one of you, but, and they start making all these little things. And with Candace Owens, the thing is like her fundamental, like the underpinning of her belief system is like cyberbullying and free speech is so wrong, that you should have your entire livelihood destroyed. And here's maybe a different analogy. It would be the internet equivalent of putting recorders and microphones in everybody's home and saying that everything that you say within your own home should be recorded, transcribed, and given to your employer. I mean, that's literally the equivalent. So with her, the issue is primarily free speech, but you see this issue across the board on every single issue. People are coming in and sort of trying to change the opinion of, again, I use air quotes here, mainstream conservative values. So the question, I guess, becomes, are people's political opinions changing? Or is it that the left is just pushing farther left and the right is pushing farther right? And so people that once were on the left and maybe had a few radical far left positions are now seeing themselves as being part of the right, sort of the traditional conservative, GOP type party system. Is that what's happening? What do you think?
I think it's a little bit of both, right? So I think that what you have, especially in Europe, if we're talking globally, right? What you have in Europe is this strange bedfellows of your traditional conservatives with people who are far left in the face of this sort of Islamic um, migration, right? So you have a large group of people who are no longer comfortable being in their classically liberal or leftist nations because now they have this large population coming in that views them as a disgusting affront to their God, right? And I think that Dave Rubin is a great example of this. He's someone who's been pushed to the right, not because he himself identifies himself as a right leaning person, but because now, to protect his own personal interest, he must view himself as right wing because he is now under threat through this sort of Islamic ideology, right? And while 20 years ago, this may have been something that he would have allied himself with um, atheists or further leftists with against traditional um, right wing conservatives in terms of Christianity, now he must make a sort of friend of my enemy or enemy of my enemy is my friend sort of deal with conservatives with regard to Islam. And I think that that's what you're seeing with regards to some leftists moving themselves further right. It's not that they're actually becoming right wing, it's more that they are now realizing that their interests are no longer served by being left wing. So they must adopt or co opt the right wing argument of, well, on these specific issues, I must adopt the authoritarian right idea of, defense or security. And so that's sort of one of those things that if you look at George W. Bush's presidency, sort of led to a lot of national surveillance in the West, right? You see the Patriot Act, you see the Freedom Act, and things like that, which sort of give the authority to the national government, the federal government, to surveil, right? To conduct surveillance on the national population, given, I think it's FISA courts permission. And I think that a person fundamentally believes what they believe, and that may change on a very small level based on how things change around them. But fundamentally, their beliefs don't change. They just decide that, well, in order to serve my interest, I may co opt or adopt this group's position for this specific purpose because I feel that if I do not, this other group is a greater threat to my personal existence and or benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think. Well, God, we're gonna get deep right off the bat here. Are you familiar with Aristotle and sort of the virtue of the mean?
Yeah.
So, is that something you subscribe to personally? Like, is that idea something you subscribe to? I guess let me quantify that real quick here. For the layman, the Aristotelian idea of the virtue of the mean is not that the most virtuous action or belief is literally the average, right? But that in each individual situation, the most virtuous action is the one that is the most measured and appropriate. So, for example, if you are very quick to anger, you would have a vice of excess, right? Irascibility would be a vice of excess. If you aren't angry when you ought to be, that would be a vice of deficiency, and so on and so forth. And there are certain situations, maybe you find your wife cheating or something like that. There are certain situations where you are 100% justified to be very, very angry. So it's not like you're measuring your anger or sadness or happiness or A, B, C, or D across the board, but that your anger, happiness, sadness, and every other emotion you can think of, compassion, are all measured and at the sort of appropriate level for what they ought to be. That is the virtuous position to hold. Do you think that is that something you agree with?
Yeah, I would say so. I think that a lot of times, or in my estimation, I think that a lot of times what the problem is that we have, or that others have, or that we all have, or can have, or have the ability to have, right? If we're really getting into this, is that the response that we have is not justified by the input, right? So you could be irrationally angry at someone filing something wrong. right? You could be irrationally angry that you're woken up 10 minutes early. You could be completely okay with the fact that your wife cheats on you, right? So I think that we have to make sure that we moderate our passions, right? To use a different word. I think that it's important that we, in our interactions with others and with the outside world, the world outside of ourselves, do so in a logical and measured way. That we do not just react on impulse, that we use logic and reason to do so. That before I say something, I think before I speak. That before I physically react, before I scream, before I yell, before I laugh, that I think about what it is I'm laughing at, that I think about what it is I'm yelling at, that I'm screaming at, that I'm hitting, that I'm going to react to before I do so. And I think it's one of those things that we don't really do as a society anymore. So yes, I would say that overall I do think that we must measure our response to an input rather than just react like that.
So the reason I bring that up is because I think one has to examine oneself and one's beliefs and recognize their own vices of deficiency and excess. Um, and when I see, for example, somebody like Red Pill Black, who has, by all accounts, radically changed their position, it seems terribly disingenuous and in many ways reminds me of sort of children, right? Children are extremely labile, and they can go from being happy to sad in I'm talking no time. You have children just like I do. They go from happy to sad like the drop of a hat. Boom, it's done. And in many ways, you look at like in high school, especially in junior high and even more so in elementary school, their opinions are constantly changing. And Red Pill Black, Candace Owens, she's not that young. What that says to me is that she has not examined her positions at all. And I'm of the belief that these positions are not genuinely held, they're not true convictions, and as such, that they should ultimately be kind of not outright disregarded, they should still be discussed and considered, but given less importance. Because the most important thing in the world to me, and I kid you not, like if you were to ask me what the most important thing is, this is it. That you not only believe in something, but that you believe in it so fully that you would put your life on the line for it. And I don't see that in her beliefs because of how she's so radically changed on the idea of free speech. And that makes me discount everything else she says.
I would actually agree with what you're saying, right? Like, so to me, I would phrase that or try to make that more concise through the term conviction, right? Does she have conviction? Does she demonstrate conviction in her beliefs? And the answer for me would be no. Because as little as a year ago, this site that you referenced earlier was trying to raise funds to continue to dox people, right? So has she come out and said, this is a terrible thing? Maybe she has, right? Maybe she has come out and said that this cyberbullying crusade that I went on was a terrible thing. But is she doing it because she truly believes it isn't? Or is she doing it because it no longer profits her as an individual? And does she have the capability to think that or believe that her personal gain is less important than the overall good for society and culture, right? And that's a question I think that needs to be asked. Does she, one of the the tenets we were talking about Aristotle's theory, right? Uh, does she look at the idea of Plato saying that, well, do you feed the beast that's inside of you with regard to your passions and your desires, or does she only give it what it needs? Does she only give herself gratification as necessary, or does she indulge herself? Is she indulging herself right now? And this is something I would apply to Joy Villa, to someone like Laura Loomer, to someone like, gosh, even Paul Joseph Watson, right? Does she or he or her, do they all think this is less about what is truly right or wrong, or rather, what is more beneficial for myself? And is it more important to have something that is beneficial for myself? Or do they have the conviction to say, you know what? Yes, this may be profitable for me as a person, as an individual, but is it right? Is it universally, objectively right? And I think you're right to call criticism there. I think that we really need to shine a light on that, especially when this aspect of the alt right or the new right, as they have now started to term themselves.
One of the parallels, I think, that goes back to conviction is this Weinstein case. So for me, right, my own personal belief is that things like rape, murder, and even like burglary are some of the most heinous crimes that one can commit. And if you also feel that way, I feel like your actions should line up with that, right? So I personally will probably, theoretically, never murder except in legally justified cases such as self-defense, right? Because even self-defense, like killing somebody in self-defense, is still murder, but it's a legally justified form of murder, right? So I myself would never rape, would never murder, would never burglarize, would never rob, these things, right? And in the Weinstein case, you see something really interesting. You see that people have remained silent until finally somebody broke the silence, and then everybody piles on and says, oh yeah, me too, me too, me too, hashtag me too, right? And it seems terribly disingenuous and like, well, you didn't see it was wrong, right? Because you didn't speak out about it. You didn't go to the police. You didn't go to, you didn't go to bat for your own personal well-being. And so there's a real disingenuous nature about these things that really disturbs me. I can't think of another word. It truly disturbs me. So things like with Red Pill Black, with Paul Joseph Watson, with, like you said, Laura Loomer, and even, dare I say it, Lauren Southern, you see that there is a real, in some ways, a disconnect between what they say they believe and the way they act. And Lauren Southern, I'll give her some credit, because she herself has been, I guess she's been sort of progressing down a right-wing path, slowly. And I grant her, the greatest respect for it, because at the very least, she, sort of lives what she believes. But like Sargon of Akkad is another great example. He identifies as a classical liberal, and, more power to him on that very topic. And at the very least, he's at least remained consistent. But I like to say, it's kind of a stupid saying, but, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. The road to progressivism is paved with libertarians. And so I take these people like Red Pill Black, everything they say I have to take with a grain of salt, because I feel like their positions are so labile that I can't take what they say seriously. I take what they say so, I guess, with such a grain of salt, because on one hand, they're like, oh yeah, I'm right-wing on this, but I'm left-wing on that, and I'm right-wing on this other topic, but I'm left-wing on this. Well, what matters to you, right? What matters to you, Red Pill Black? Is free speech something that matters to you? And you see this even in the far right. I was having a conversation just 2 days ago about sort of genocide, right? The idea of genocide. And the question was brought up, like, is genocide of other people okay, right? Because obviously we have a problem with, the replacement and displacement of whites, but is it okay to replace and displace other people, right? Like if there was a mass migration of whites to Africa, for example, is that okay? And this person I was talking to said yes. And I said, well, that's a hypocritical position to take, because my belief, my sincerely held belief, is that if something applies to me, it must apply to everybody. And if something applies to everybody, it also must apply to me. There has to be a reversal, right? And this, I guess, all ties in many ways to this Aristotelian idea of the virtue of the mean. The virtuous position, in my mind, is that if I'm willing to apply something to somebody else, I must be willing to apply that to myself.
Well, I think that there's a little bit of nuance there, right? And I think that it must deal with the scenario of history, right? So, do we as white Western Americans deserve to be displaced because of our past conquest, or have we earned this land, right? Like, I don't think that it can't be argued, right? It cannot be argued that we did not build the nation that is America. Because before, where there is America, where there is California, where there is Utah, where there is Colorado, where there is Nebraska, where there is West Virginia, Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, before there was no nation, right? There were nations. There were collective groups of people who were effectively living a very primitivist lifestyle. And our people came here to found nations, right? Like, not not without some ill on their hands, right? Like, they do things that I today would not do? Of course they did. Absolutely they would. But we are living in a society which has been reformed. We are living in a society, in a world which no longer has to deal with irrigation being only a, well, has the rain fallen this year? We have wells that go deeper than the deepest mines that they could burrow out when this nation was founded. So, do I think that there are some nuances to the argument? Absolutely, I do, right? Because those things have happened. But do we deserve to be punished because of the sins of our ancestors? Is there inheritable sin? Well, yes and no, right? Because we know that if you have a family that's broken, that you're more likely to live in poverty, right? We know that if you live in a world where, or we know that if you live in a country that has no value placed on the family, that there will be issues. We know lots of things, right? But do we hold ourselves to that knowledge? Do we hold ourselves accountable to what we know to be true? I think that's the larger question, right? Like, should we, I would agree with you, right now, should white Africans, right, should they be wiped out? No, I don't think so. Should those people be killed? No. Should they perhaps leave Africa? Yeah, I'd say maybe. It doesn't seem like it's tenable for them to live there. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be beneficial for Africans, right? Because someone's going to fill the void that they left. And those people will be the Chinese right now. And will that be beneficial for Africans in the long run? No. Because there's a very big difference between Chinese and Western culture, Asian and Western European culture. And that difference is that there isn't that same empathy, there isn't that tolerance, right? If the native population will not adhere to the desires of the imperialistic Chinese, then they will be replaced. There will be no question about whether or not they will be. In fact, we already are starting to see this notion that the Chinese have. Millions of Chinese are now living in Africa. It's not something we talk about. It's not something we report as Westerners, but to sort of go back to this idea of whether or not someone like a Red Pill Black actually believes what she says. Well, I think that as Westerners, we've proven we do, right? Like we're committing suicide in a sense in order to try to prove that what we believe is true. But unfortunately, I think we're starting to realize that, well, unfortunately, what we believed in for years is a lie. That this idea that multiculturalism will succeed and make us all stronger, it's not true. It just isn't, unfortunately. Can we all exist separately and benefit? Perhaps we can. Do we all deserve to have our separate identities? Absolutely. And now we go back to Red Pill Black versus, or I'm sorry. And now we go to Red Pill Black. Does she truly believe that she's a conservative? No, of course she doesn't. But does it benefit her now? Does she see a window where she can enter the conservative doctrine, let's say, and somehow gain notoriety, gain attention because she does not fit what America thinks of as a conservative? Yes. And American conservatives will take her and they will put her up as a figurehead and say, look, this woman is conservative and she's a black woman. See, we're not racist. We're not sexist. And therein lies the flaw in American conservatives, right? That we think that just because a woman, a black woman, or anyone claims that they are conservative is actually conservative. We no longer have as a greater movement of conservatism this idea that, well, you must be conservative, because that's less important than, well, can you make it seem like conservatives are not racist, are not sexist? And that has become the central theme behind it, right? Like, we will parrot that it matters that they're not white males, but in reality, who else will look out for white males? Who else will look out for white families? And I think we really need to have a very frank conversation about that within the conservative movement at large.
We absolutely do. But this is a really interesting segue into moral foundation theory. Is it something you're familiar with?
I haven't been too familiar with it, but I am reading up on it now.
So to break it down into like the absolute crash course, basically there are 5 foundations of belief, and these 5 foundations are, and there's of course a dichotomy here, right? There's a duality: care and harm, fairness and cheating, loyalty or betrayal, authority and subversion, and sanctity and degradation. Okay? And what, as people have studied this, what they sort of, the whole position is that all political beliefs can be kind of chopped down into these 5 issues. That, everything you believe can be sort of pigeonholed into these 5 issues. And it's not something I terribly disagree with. However, what we see is that liberals put a disproportionate amount of value in things like care and harm and fairness and cheating, right? And we can see this, of course. I mean, it's sort of a, well, duh, of course they do. But we see this in like every aspect of the laws and things that they push forward. So what they don't care about, though, is things like loyalty, authority, and sanctity or purity. Purity is the more easy thing to, the easier word to digest there. However, the traditionalists, more conservative people, interestingly, put an emphasis on all of these things. This is the fundamental difference between sort of the liberals and the conservatives. So, whereas liberals say, the most important thing is that we take care of people and that we are fair to them, right? That they are not being sort of given a bad, bad lot, right? That they get what everybody else gets. Equality, right? But especially for conservatives. So whereas liberals put very, very low, very, very low value in things like purity, authority, and loyalty, conservatives actually say, well, we put less emphasis on that, but we actually do care about things like care, fairness, loyalty, authority, and sanctity. Libertarians, on the other hand, and this is kind of why I have something of a love-hate relationship with them, they actually have a very low representation on all of them, right? So it's almost a nihilistic type representation. Like they're kind of like, I really don't have a big opinion on any of these. It's very much a centrist type thing. So what we see is that, in fact, there is a difference in the way we believe and the way we perceive the world. And it's something I'm going to get into here in just a second. And we see this in things like, I think you can, break this down on a number of different fronts, the least of which not being race. I'm looking at a Pew Research study from 2015 where they were polled on government aid to the poor, right? Sort of social welfare. And it breaks it down. This is based on religion. And it says that for all affiliated, you're looking at a 47% more good than harm, 47% more harm than good, and other 6%, right? However, then you start breaking it down and you say, okay, Protestant, 45-49, Evangelical, 38-56. But then it gets really interesting. Historically black, 66% believe that government aid to the poor, 66% believe it's more good than harm, 27% more harm than good, and 7% other. Atheists, 74% more good than harm, 23% more harm than good. Agnostics, 65-29, and so on and so forth. The point is that I will grant that people have sincerely held convictions, but we have to acknowledge that simply labeling oneself as being red-pilled as such, or being a conservative, does not necessarily mean that a person is, because you have to look at how they fundamentally view the entire world around them. That's such a weird thing to even say. It's weird that it even has to be talked about. But the most important thing is, what are your convictions and how do you live them? If I say that the most important thing, as far as like the outcome for children, is the nuclear family, I have to live that, or else it's a disingenuous position, right? I can't preach from a pulpit and say, you shouldn't smoke and you shouldn't drink, but then go out and drink and smoke. That doesn't make any sense. That makes me a hypocrite. So, I guess all of that is to say this. Examine everything that everybody says and ask yourself, as anybody, even me, as you listen, ask yourself, does this person live what they're talking about? If I talk about fitness, am I out in the gym, 4 or 5 days a week? Am I living what I say is important to me? It's just I don't know. To me, it's a good quantifier of what you actually think. We can see in Congress is a fantastic example. These people who are elected Republican representatives, and yet they vote against the Republican base all the time. well, you don't actually believe anything. You're just there to, as you say, Western one, um, you're just there to profit and to take advantage. And what a shame that is the case. But there are charlatans among us. Of course there are. And just ask yourself what is truly important to you across the board, on every facet of your belief system. What is important to you, and what do you actually think? Take the Socratic method and apply it to yourself. Spend some time. You have some downtime. You're just sitting around watching TV. Spend some time and actually think about it. What means something to me? Is family important to me? If so, why is it important to me? And could family be important to somebody else in the same way? And if it's not, why isn't it important to them in the same way? And should it be important to them in the same way? Ask yourself these questions.
Yeah, I think you're dead on with the the application of this label. That, do you truly hold these convicted beliefs? Do you lead by example? Do you live the life that you preach? Those are very important things that I think that we all really need to think about, right? So for my life, right? When I tell my children that I want them to live a more disciplined life, do I demonstrate that I live a more disciplined life? Can I point to examples in what I do and how I act that shows that I am showing deference to what is actually best rather than what I want? Can I show them what the benefits are of delayed gratification rather than instant gratification? Can I show them that hard work pays off? Right? Can I demonstrate that what I'm telling them is true rather than just saying that, oh, do this, not because I live it, not because I do it myself, but rather because I tell you that this is the correct way to live. There are a lot of things that I think that we as a society no longer do, right? We have tended to think of ourselves in puritanical terms for a long time, but we long ago abandoned puritanical ideal structures. We no longer hold ourselves accountable to the same way that we hold others accountable. We no longer seek to look within. We rather look at someone else and say, "Ha, there's the flaw. This person." And what's really interesting to me is that in current American society, it is perfectly acceptable for everyone but whites. And when I say whites, I mean European whites, right? Like, I don't mean Middle Eastern whites. I don't mean Persian whites. I mean true European whites, specifically WASPs, right? That that terrible group. Can they say, well, you know what? I'm I am struggling not because of my own flaws, not because of my own failures, but rather because I've created a system which advantages other people over me, right? And we don't look at those things. We don't look at this world where we have sort of allowed ourselves to abandon righteousness, which is a really weird thing to me. When I grew up, it was always, we must, make a sound decision, right? And I think this is one of those things that's really hypocritical of the left. That they have this, and I don't mean to speak ill of the left generally, but rather this is a flaw that they have, is that they don't acknowledge the fact that they put out conflicting messages. They say, don't objectify women, but don't slut shame. Well, a woman can be righteous or she can be not righteous, right? She can be slutty or not slutty. She can be modest or she can be immodest. to say that there are shades of gray is true, but you must understand that if you trend harder right or left on any of those things, if you look at it as a line or linearly, then that's where you fit. And I think that we really have to get to a point where we understand that, you know what? Can a person change? Yes. But do they demonstrate the change through how they live? Do they live it? Right? Not do they say it. Do they live it? Is Red Pill Black going out and saying, you know what? It's wrong. It's wrong to dox people because of what they think. It's wrong to try to ruin their lives because they disagree with you. Right? What has she done to seek penance for what she has done? Right? Like, has she demonstrated that she would like to truly repent for her actions? I don't think so, right? She sees an opportunity to profit from a movement that is gaining traction. She sees an opportunity to derail a movement which is growing, is becoming more and more likely to alienate her and her group. So absolutely, she needs to do everything she can to subvert it. And I understand that, right? I understand her desire to do that. But you know what? If you truly believe in your people and yourself, then have self-determinism, right? Have faith in yourself. And I think that as Westerners, we really need to take a hard look at how hard we are on ourselves and whether or not we are holding everyone to the same standard that we hold ourselves to.
What was the name of that YouTuber? The oh god, what was she's like 19. She was the German girl. She was in the skeptic community, so called, and she made that video, kind of about race. Do you remember who I'm talking about? What was her name?
Rage After
Rage After the Storm. Yes, her. So I'm reminded of her, and she is a particularly sad case to me because here she was exposed to these ideas, and I think she probably adopted them, and most likely lived them. And she was in many ways excommunicated for her beliefs. But what we didn't see from her is this, and this is why I respect her, I guess, this sort of backpedaling, right? This, oh my god, no, you guys are right, oh my god, I should have never said something like that. No, absolutely not. You just see that in fact she was exposed to these new ideas and adopted them, and she was excommunicated, and instead of trying to combat them, she kind of took it with grace, and you have to respect that. And maybe that's where my whole issue with the new right comes in. It seems to me that most of the time there's sort of these hyper individualistic libertarian types who say, on one hand, individualism matters and you can be whatever you want to be, and they don't, I guess, their ideas, their convictions are not morally or logically consistent. And it's a real problem for me. I try to examine everybody's beliefs in that way. If you say, for example, that the best thing that white Europeans can do is, go out, have children, and raise them in, a loving home. Okay, great. How many kids do you have? Right? And overwhelmingly, the answer is going to be, well, none, or whatever. Well, why? So don't preach to me and tell me that that's the case when you aren't living it yourself. So I guess this whole conversation has been to say this: if you say you believe something, then by God, you need to live it. And if you aren't living it, then you need to think about why you're not living it.
Yeah, I think actually you touched on a really important thing to me, which is that if you actually care about let's say that you think, well, whites are demographically being replaced. Well, have you found someone to marry? And have you found someone that you want to have children with? Now, if you can't have children, I understand that. I really do. It's tragic. I'm sorry. But how long did you wait? And are you just being selfish? Are you thinking about, well, I don't want to have kids now because I can't this or I can't that? Well, think about it this way. Your children, regardless of how much wealth you have, will likely be raised with more privilege, regardless of what race you are, than you ever could have been in the current year, right? Like you will have more opportunity, more wealth, more of an expectation of what it is to be unimpoverished than anyone else before you. And I think that you have to think about it more in terms of, if I really want to change the world, how am I going to do it? Well, one of the best ways to do it is by having a family and by teaching them the things that you believe. And it's very, a lot of people, both on right wing and left wing groups, say, well, grassroots this, grassroots that. Well, you know what's really grassroots is having a family, right? Having a family and teaching that family by example, by leadership, living the life that you preach, right? And you're exactly right. That's exactly what you have to do. Don't say, oh, well, I want to make sure that this country doesn't change so much, or that whites don't die out or get diminished. Well, have you sat down and said, you know what? Maybe I'm being unrealistic in what my expectation is for my children, right? Maybe I'm putting the cart before the horse. Maybe it's unrealistic to think that I can wait and wait and wait and then have children. Because eventually you're going to be too old. One of the things that we really see now is this idea that, well, we're not fertile anymore. We might as well give up. Well, is it that we're not fertile? Or is it that they're, unfortunately, right, we're top heavy? Our population as whites, as Westerners, is old. So, of course, they're not fertile. They're older. But if you're 20, if you're 25, if you're 30, if you're 35, you're still fertile. Have kids. And don't be so selfish. Don't think that that's not important. Don't think that it's more important to learn how to use arms or to learn how to be involved in politics. Having a family is the best way to ensure that the next generation will have your values, more so than anything else. Especially if you don't believe in this notion that culture and society are purely a construct of society, right?
I mean, that's really the whole crux of the issue, isn't it? That if you say something is important, you have to live it. And the question that needs to be asked of everybody is, what are you doing to live that value, right? So if you say the Second Amendment is important to me, okay, I grant you that. Is it important to you because of some ideological reason? I feel that other people should 100% be able to, defend themselves against, any sort of threat to their person, including but not limited to the government. Okay, that's at least an ideologically consistent position, right? You say, like, I personally don't want to own any firearms, but I respect that other people want to. Okay, yeah, sure, great, no problem. I grant you that. But if you say, like, one of the most important things to me is that, we have the right to own guns, and then you say, well, I personally don't own guns. Well, wait, what? Why don't you own guns then? If you say, like, the most important thing to me is that, or one of the most important things to me is that people aren't using welfare. Okay, do you take welfare at all? If so, then you're not living it. I myself, I personally have never taken a single dime of welfare. I've taken charity from my parents, who have supported me through rough times, through my periods of homelessness. Um, of course, I think everybody at some point has accepted some form of charity. Uh, but I've never accepted welfare, and I refuse to accept welfare at all. I would honestly, I would do anything to never accept welfare. If it means I have to work 4 jobs, then, well, I guess I'm working 4 jobs. I guess I'm working 16-hour days, 7 days a week, if that's what it means, because that's how important it is to me. But I don't know, we've harped on this long enough, but, my God, it's really an important issue to me that people live what they say they mean to live. Brent here, who I brought up before, is a fantastic example of it. He talks about fitness all the time, and by God, he's out there, 5 to 7 days a week, hitting the gym, losing weight, getting big. This is what he values, and he's living it. So who can blame the guy? So to segue, not in any organic way, Sweden just put out some information, and oh my God, I don't even know where to begin with it. The nuts and bolts of it is that rape in Sweden is committed by 84%. 84% of people committing rape are people of non-European descent. 2/3 of all rape is committed by asylum seekers or people with a residence permit. 95.6% of all assault rapes are committed by people of non-European descent. 90% of all group rapes are committed by people of non-European descent. And 85% of all group rapes against men are committed by Afghans. Whew. Diversity is our strength.
Yeah, I think this really gets into an issue of, are we being so altruistic that we're not paying attention to reality, right? Sweden has had a long track record of this, right? Like they did the same thing when Pinochet took over Chile, right? Like they allowed all of these groups from Chile to come into Sweden and have permanent residency, right? But they never vetted any of them. And they never made sure that they were actually political asylum seekers. They just said, well, surely you wouldn't lie about this. Surely you're not a criminal, right? And so what they did was they just opened the doors. They let all these people come in. And they've done it again. This notion that by coming to live with us, we are so great. And this is actually a real downfall of Western liberalism, right? This is how we as a group fail. We believe in our own hubris. We fall victim to our own folly, right? We think that we are so great that we have no flaw, right? We no longer can see that the ideas we have only fit within a very small structure, and that is with our own cultural groups. We can't make Americans out of Afghans. We can't make Swedes out of Somalis. We can't make Germans out of Guineans. It's not possible. We can try and we can succeed on an individual level, but can we make China America? No, of course not. It's a foolish thing to think. They have their own histories, their own traditions, right? And we have to look at every point of data we can to try to solve crime, right? If we're being honest with ourselves, right? There's a reason in America why we collect ethnic data with regard to crime. And it's not because we're racist. It's because we are trying to fight crime more effectively. If a different ethnic group commits a different rate of crime, then we need to make sure that if there's a neighborhood, if there's a city, if there's a town that has a greater majority of that ethnic group, then we have a greater majority of police in that, or we have a greater number of police in that area to make sure we offset the fact that they are more likely to commit crime. And we shouldn't encourage their growth, right? We, as a people, are unfortunately beholden to our own ideals, whether they're false or true. And I think that's really something we've got to really work on. And again, I think we've, or at least I've said it before, we need to have an honest conversation about what we believe to be true and what is true, and come to terms with it and try to govern ourselves and develop institutions that reflect that reality and not what we would like to be true.
You hit on a very interesting point that I want to kind of expound on. I'll probably make a separate video on it just because it is that important. And it's the idea that, you know, people are in many ways the representatives of their culture. And when you bring people in who, you know, let's say they're even genuinely looking for a better life, right? That sort of meme that's out there. They're actually looking for a better life, and they want a better place to be. What we see, in fact, is that they aren't representing at all the native population. Stefan Molyneux, I think, has touched on this a number of times. For all his, you know, all the problems with the things he says, he's bang on a lot of issues. A good example is this idea of sort of the, you know, natural conservative Hispanics. Well, when you see their actual voting patterns, the general public typically leans Democrat. I mean, this is just a reality. The general public is something like 50% Democrat and you know, something like 10% independent and 40% Republican. And that's just the general public. You know, whites, it's, you know, more conservative, conservative Republican. It's almost a 50-50 split for whites. But, you know, overall, the leaning is more Democrat. For Hispanics, it's 20% Republican and 66% Democratic. For first-generation Hispanics, you know, the idea that they'll assimilate, you know, they'll end up being more like the average American over time. The first-generation Hispanics, 63% Democratic and 16% Republican. So the only thing that happens there is they become more independent. Second-generation Hispanics. So you're talking 50 years. They've lived 50 years in this country at this point. If we go by, you know, the 25-year generation idea. Second-generation Hispanics, 71% Democrat and 19% Republican. I mean, holy crap. You know, it's things like this that make me say, like, well, no, you know, assimilation isn't possible, integration isn't possible, and what are we doing even repeating this idea, you know, and putting it out there? It has no basis in reality. We see and this is my concern, right? So in the UK, we've seen this happen now, where so they imported a bunch of Middle Eastern or North African Muslims, and there was a huge uptick in crime rate. Huge, enormous, like statistically significant uptick in crime rate. Well, what happened is now they've been here for so long, they're being born there, right? And so in crime statistic reporting, what ends up happening is they say, well, they're native born, right? They're a native born UK resident. But they're not. Their parents weren't, right? They're first generation. I don't know. I mean, God, I could talk about this all night. It's just really a fascinating thing that, the people bring their culture. Everywhere, globally, people bring their culture. And you can't stop it. It doesn't matter if you are the 99th percentile from Africa or from India or from Mexico. You will bring your culture with you. And I think a fair argument can be made that it's genetic. I mean, I'm sure, some scientist or some, super liberal in the comments is going to, flip their shit over that. But I think it is 100% genetic. I think genetics informs culture, and study after study after study is showing that, in fact, different ethnicities vote different ways regardless of how long they've been here.
Well, I think it's demonstrable, right? I mean, look at Black America, right? They vote overwhelmingly Democratic. And this is one of those really funny things to me. What you will hear Republicans say is that, the Democrats are the real racist because they were the ones opposed to ending slavery, and they were the ones that were for segregation. But really, all we did was switch ideals. The Republican Party became more about conserving American culture, Western European culture. And in the past, what they had an issue with was not that blacks were equal to whites or that they could assimilate to and live with whites, but rather that we shouldn't enslave them. And I agree, that was wrong, right? And most whites would agree now. And I'd probably suggest that 99% of whites would agree that that was wrong or that it was not correct, in the sense that whether it was morally wrong or right, but whether it was correct to have done, right? I think that there are lots of arguments to be had there. But back to the issue at hand, there's no value in saying that, well, they are the real racist, because the term racist itself and how we use it and how we apply it has no value, because now what we're saying is, well, your value is gone because you believe this. And so what we're saying is that because you believe something that we think is wrong, and when I say we, I mean leftist America and leftist Western society is wrong, then you have no value and you have no say, and you should have no say. And in fact, and this is the real irony, right? Leftists will dehumanize those that have ideas that they consider racist or prejudiced or, gosh, I hate to say it, but Nazi-esque, right? As inhuman. You are no longer human. You are, therefore, subject to any violence, any abuse, any hatred that we feel justified in bringing to you. Which is interesting, because only a few decades ago, that wouldn't have been the case. And I think that if you look at, and you're right to really bring this to the fore, demographically, Latinos are incredibly socialistic, right? They do not care a whit about free markets and self-determinism. They don't. It's demonstrable in their governments. Look at Brazil. Look at Mexico. Look at El Salvador. Look at Guatemala. Look at Belize. Look at Venezuela. It's not a value that they hold dear. So, if they come to the United States, which still has better benefits than their nations, because the the United States is less socialistic, and therefore we have more wealth that we can redistribute, then they will arguably be in the right for their position. Vote for the Democrats who, again, in this sort of sacrificial mentality, pass legislation and support legislation which is to the detriment of the domestic American, whether they're white or black or Hispanic. And that's really where I think we have to really laugh, right? In America, at least, it doesn't even matter if you're white or black or Hispanic. Regardless, the end game of the Democratic Party is to deconstruct American identity and ultimately weaken the position of any American, whether they belong to the white demographic, the black demographic, the Hispanic, or Asian demographic. And I think that's really what's telling to me that there's a lack of ability for certain groups to think of short or long-term gain. Because for blacks, in the long term, having more Hispanics is not better for more blacks. It's worse. Because they are demonstrably less tolerant of blacks. And vice versa. So, it's really one of those things where I have a hard time, and maybe it's my white privilege talking, understanding these groups and their voting practices, because no matter what, they don't vote in their own interest in short term or long term.
No, they don't. And I struggle with the idea, the Donald is, oh my God, there's a lot that I love about the Donald. I do love their fervor and their sort of blind appreciation for Donald Trump. And I think many of them are true patriots, right? But what I see is this this weird idea of look at this based black transgender whoever, right? And they're hailed as some sort of I don't know. I guess it's this idea of like you mentioned before. We're not the real racists. They are. We're not really transphobic. They are. No. Do you understand, the Donald? If you're listening, do you understand that these people are voting against you? Do you understand that the people that you hail as, sort of the epitome of black culture or Asian culture or Hispanic culture, do you understand that these people are voting against you largely? I mean, it's not even, there's no contest. Again, we're talking 70 to 20%, right? I mean, it's not a 50-50 split, right? Huge discrepancy in the way they vote. It's time that we stop acting like, people are, because a black man, everything exists on a bell curve, right? Everything. I truly believe everything exists on a bell curve. It's time we stop acting like these anecdotes, right? The base black man, or the base Jew, or the base Asian, or the base transgender. They're on board with the MAGA ideal. It's time we stop acting like they're the average, like everybody's a secret conservative, or everybody's a secret traditionalist, because they're not. They're just not. And it's time we stop acting like they are.
Yeah, I mean, I think you make a really great point. When you look at, you know, one of the big tenets of the liberals now, the leftists, the cultural Marxists, is to harp on that 1%. But let's dissect the 1%. Demographically, who is the 1%, right? Like, overwhelmingly, are they white? No. Whites actually don't make up a statistically appropriate number of those people in the United States. Are they Jewish? Well, actually, they make up a disproportionate portion of that percentage, right? Well, how is that? What about the Asians? They make up a disproportionate percentage of that group of the population. So why are we always harping on the one group that is the majority? Is it just because they're the majority? Because let's look at it in the context of 100 years. We went from being, as whites, because I am white, fair disclosure, I am a complete wasp. I'm not even Polish, so sorry for you. But let's look at where we are 100 years from 1920, right? We go from being 30% of the population to less than 10. So, are we oppressing and destroying these groups of people? Or are we destroying ourselves? Or are we being subject to a personal genocide, a global genocide, a cosmopolitan death? Like, what's really going on? Are we really holding all the people of the world under our boot? Or are we like kind of slowly killing ourselves? Because if you look at it, right, like even though we're the most diverse group, right, that's the true like sort of thing that makes me laugh, right? The thing that makes me go from tragedy to comedy is that I have to laugh because we say diversity, diversity, cultural, multicultural, but we're the most diverse group that exists, both in genotype and phenotype. We have blonde hair, we have brown hair, we have black hair, we have red hair regularly. We have gray eyes, we have blue eyes, we have amber eyes, we have brown eyes, we have everything. We are the spectrum, right? And yet we're told that we're not diverse enough? We're fair, we're beige, we're sallow, we're swarthy. What else do we need to do? Like what we're at a point now where we're told that well, Hispanics are white, right? Middle Easterners are white. Are they though? Do you consider them to be white? Like, do we determine whiteness or does someone else? And do we determine our privilege or does someone else? Like, what is it to be a Westerner? Do we get to decide that? We don't get to determine what is African or what is Asian. I think that we really have to take a look at are we being subject or are we suffering for our own ideals unduly, unjustly? And I think if we really take a step back or take 3 or 4 steps back and really evaluate where we're at, I think we'll find that we're making a lot of mistakes.
You know, I just want to compliment the verbiage you used. Swarthy. I mean, wow. Last time I heard that in a conversation, it's been years. You know, it is interesting though. Look at look at let's just even say philosophy. Okay, you go back to Thales, you go back to Parmenides, you go back to Pythagoras, or all these other people. Oh my God, the diversity in opinion and in thought, no doubt. And okay, I grant a fair argument could be made. Well, these are all these are all sort of white ideas, right? These everything that you're talking about is, these are white people. Okay, yeah, sure. Yeah, I'll grant that. But, oh my God, everything from like I said, Thales to, the sort of Locks and all these people. What an incredible spread of ideas that we have. To say that we aren't diverse is just, it boggles the mind. We are so diverse. What is diversity? Is diversity just brown people? Is anybody saying, we all know the answer to this. Everybody listening right now knows the answer to this. Diversity is not, diversity of thought. It's diversity of skin color, and it's not even diversity of skin color in the idea like, well, you need a black person, a brown person, a purple person or a red person. It doesn't mean that at all. It means, people who aren't white. And oh my God, just, if you took 1,000 white people and put them together and said, all right, what's your opinion on whatever? You're going to have such a diversity of thought that it will be staggering. But that's not enough, It's not enough, because they're still pale-skinned, Western European people. And it will never be enough. And that's precisely why Sweden is in the state it's in. It's why London is now a majority non-white. It's a majority Arab now. I was thinking, I went to the store. Was it? Yeah, it was yesterday. I went to the store yesterday. And, I went to the zoo with the kid about a month ago. And I distinctly remember as a child going to those places, into the mall, right? I distinctly remember going, and Hispanics and blacks were something of a novelty. They were, it was rare to see them. I wouldn't even say rare, but it was uncommon, right? And now I went to the store, and easily 50% of the people, if not more, were Hispanic and speaking Spanish. And I'm in the Midwest. It's not like I live right next to the border or anything. I'm quite far north of the border, actually. And blacks are, you still don't see them too much unless you go to the areas of town in which they live. But man, we are just really displacing ourselves. And I was asking the wife this. I said, well, where do we go from here? Is our fate to go to Alaska? Is that where we're all destined to live? Is Alaska where nobody else wants to be? It's just really, really interesting to me, and a real problem. Diversity truly is a code word for not white.